I don't think I've ever come across an enigma like David Cage. He's a good developer, he's a bad developer, he's an okay developer, he's the worst developer ever, he's an alright developer. All that comes in and out of conversations at sporadic intervals. He is possibly the strangest creator alive in terms of reception. All his games have received polarizing reactions from fans and critics alike. He's won awards based on his writing, yet he's often criticized for his narrative. It's gotten to a point that a discussion about him or his games becomes infuriating because you can find both good and bad aspects, with barely any middle ground. David Cage bothers me more than possibly any other developer on the planet. He bothers me more than Neil Druckmann, more than Peter Molyneux, more than Randy goddamn Pitchford, because whilst it's easy to summarise those previous figures easily, Druckmann for disconnected gameplay, Molyneux for the constant cycle of failed promises, and Randy for doubling down on lies, David Cage is both easy and hard to describe. He is an enigma. With David Cage's next game, Detroit Become Human, likely coming out sometime next year, I thought it would be best to try and understand why David Cage and his games bother me in a describable way. I'm going to do this by showing why Heavy Rain isn't a good game, though arguably still his best. Heavy Rain was released early 2010 to very positive reception. It was a killer app for the PlayStation 3, became a benchmark for graphics technology, and is currently the 14th best-selling game on the system. 10th if you only consider exclusives. Though they originally garnered attention with the ambitious but still flat Fahrenheit, or Indigo Prophecy, Quantic Dream cemented themselves as a developer to keep an eye on in the modern hemisphere. David Cage became an industry icon, and the audience reception was very positive. It's a game that commonly appears on best of lists, ranging from best of the year, best of system, and sometimes best of all time. It's currently rated 87 on Metacritic with 73 near-perfect scores, has an audience score of 7.7, and was included in the 1001 Games You Must Play Before You Die book, released the same year as the game's release. When reading the reviews, you can see common praise in certain areas. It's visually spectacular, your decisions actually matter, the QTE input is an improvement from Fahrenheit, which isn't saying much considering what you're working with, and the story is genuinely intriguing, from the unique characters to the overarching plot. I find the latter point really problematic for reasons I will get into soon, but I'm willing to admit that I do agree with some of the same points a lot of these reviewers bring up. Visuals, gameplay improvements, mostly technical achievements, and the reason why I don't really have a problem with them is that it's easy to sum up its objective qualities. It's a game that has mechanically aged well, or to put it in context, the game released 7 years ago, and picking up the controller and replaying it for the first time in 5 years wasn't as jarring as it should be. Though, admittedly, the camera controls are still awful and the visuals have certainly dated, but the game did set the benchmark for realistic presentation in video games at the time. So if I have a lot of positive thoughts about the game, why do I believe it's not very good and undeserving of these scores? Or to put it simply, why don't I like Heavy Rain? And the answer is actually very simple. David Cage. I know it's kind of a cop-out, pointing fingers to one person. Games are made by several teams separated into specific responsibilities, and if something doesn't work, then it's that team's fault. For instance, the story of Mankind Divided and some specific gameplay features are questionable at best and baffling at worst, but I don't point all the blame on Jean-Francois Dugas, Mary DeMarle, or Olivier Prol. The reason why is because even though Dugas was the creative lead of Mankind Divided, his direct involvement was likely in looking at design ideas, tweak them to be in line with the overall creative vision, shutting down bad ones, and signing off on those that do work. The role is obviously more complex than what I described. I'm not someone to presume exactly what someone's job role requires them to do, but the point still stands. The mistakes in Mankind Divided can't be solely levelled on the director. The problems Heavy Rain, and by extension Beyond Two Souls have, can interestingly be confidently levelled at David Cage, and only David Cage, because his approach to creating games is by using a different medium as a reference. Trying to make your game filmic is something more easily said than done, something Ready at Dawn can attest to. The gameplay is there solely for the story, not for the sake of mechanics. On the positive side, the gameplay is well presented and the colour scheme makes it easy to get more absorbed into the story, but on the negative side, when the story does fall flat, and it often does, it has nothing to support itself upon. In order to really explain why this narrative doesn't work clearly, I'm going to dissect the story in 5 chunks. Throughout the game, you switch between 4 main characters, and this makes trying to explain the story in chronological order confusing. So instead, I'm going to start with Ethan's story, then Jayden's, then Scott's, then Madison's, before looking at the finale. So let's start this dissection with Ethan Mars, arguably the main protagonist. When we are introduced to Ethan Mars, he is just an architect with a happy family who is preparing for his older son Jason's birthday. He takes showers, puts on clothes, looks at birds that suddenly die minutes later, and also lives in an extremely nice house with a great back garden in addition to being a stay-at-home architect, so naturally he's the man we have to connect with. Other characters in his family include his wife, Grace, who you'll probably forget when the game gets started proper, Jason, the world's most annoying kid as you'll soon see, and Sean, the only family member who really matters in the bigger picture. He takes his wife and 2 sons to a mall, where after purchasing a balloon for Jason for $2, no, seriously, it's $2, loses his oldest son in the crowd. After some searching, he finds his son outside and on the other side of a 4-lane road. After seeing his father, Jason does the exact opposite of what 10-year-old kids are taught, and just runs across the street without looking either direction. Ethan, realising a distant car is coming towards the boy, yet doesn't pay attention to the one that nearly hits him, tries to stop him and save his life. Despite taking the brunt of the car's force, Jason dies anyway, leaving the viewer more frustrated at child characters, and leaving drivers questioning how aware this driver was when heading towards the kid with the bright red balloon. What speed was this woman going at when she hit this kid and Ethan? You know that hitting someone at 30 miles an hour gives the receiver an 80% chance of living, and with Ethan taking the brunt of the force, shouldn't the chances of surviving increase? Actually, if the force was so strong that it left Ethan in a 6-month coma, what did the kid die of? Why is this confusing? According to David Cage, the root cause of this confusion was actually a request on Sony's end. The original cut would have had Jason flying through the air and roll on the ground, before cueing his mother's scream seen in the final cut. Sony was understandably iffy on the idea of a child getting brutalized by a car, and Cage had it changed to what we see today. So why can't we have Ethan take the brunt of the force and go over the car, while Jason also takes the brunt, but goes down off camera? A smashed window screen would have added more impact to the collision, and would have had the response of, yeah, he's dead, instead of, wait, he's dead? What a pathetic death for a useless, irritating character. It's bad enough that the kid wanders off and somehow managed to cross this road when his parents weren't looking, but combined with the gameplay forcing you down a series of events and refusing to let you off the beaten path, it's essentially trying to get you invested in this plight. You can't diverge off the path to the balloon. Ethan calls out to Jason and that causes him to turn around and run across the street. Even if you don't want him to, the game will not let you progress in your way. It might not have been so bad if one of the game's marketing hooks wasn't about choice, and if the chapter was actually well executed in its writing and directing. Take a look at Sean. He should be concerned that his older brother just died in front of him, but instead of looking shocked or upset, he just looks bored. Yeah, my brother got run over and died. Yeah, whatever. The game fast forwards 2 years. Ethan is alive, but he and his wife have separated. He experiences blackouts and has developed a fear of crowds. His son is distant and now goes to a shrink in order to treat his grief. One of these blackouts occurs after putting your son to sleep, waking up in the middle of the road and holding an origami figure. While this can present an interesting mystery, it should be noted that Ethan suffers only one other blackout afterwards. It is mentioned maybe 1 or 2 more times before no longer becoming a factor in the story. Once again, the explanation for why these were dropped was due to cut content. Originally, the game was going to have supernatural elements in the form of a spiritual bond between Ethan Mars and Scott Shelby due to the car accident. The blackouts would lead into these swimming sections where Ethan would explore Scott's memories, which would include the origami killer's victims. This cut content left behind scars in the story, such as the blackouts, the origami figures that appear in Ethan's hand when he comes to, and a confusing section near the beginning when Ethan reads a newspaper.
I've seen that face before.
Anyways, Ethan heads to a park with his son where he takes part in several activities of your choosing. You can ride the swings, seesaw, and teach Sean how to throw a boomerang. During this chapter, you'll likely experience the cognitive dissonance between you and the characters. The chapter is poorly thought out in general, partially due to Sean switching between empty husk and loving son at the drop of a hat, but mainly due to the existence of this carousel. Every single activity in the park is based on player choice. You chose to ride the swing. You chose to teach Sean how to throw a boomerang. You chose to spin him around and around and around. You get my point. But when you are given the option to leave, Sean asks you to let him ride the carousel. Without a shred of player input, Ethan agrees and encourages him to get on while you go get a ticket. You're the adult. Choices are one of the game's primary selling points. Why can't you tell Sean no? Leaving the park with him before a blackout could plant the possibility that Ethan is the origami killer in the player's head, but instead, David Cage wants the player to play the game his way. In the interest of fairness, I replayed the chapter to try and see if you can leave the park in any other way, but no. You buy the ticket, and you watch Sean ride the carousel before blacking out. He wakes up to find his son missing. Nowhere to be found. Ethan goes to the police, but it's clear that Lieutenant Carter Blake is not only dismissive, but pretty much the archetypical asshole cop for reasons we will see later. I understand that the police might not want to automatically link the disappearance to the origami killer, but considering another young boy was just discovered, in addition to the weather being consistent with the killings, you'd think that they would take the case much more seriously. Regardless of choices, you have a brief argument with Grace Mars before she blames Ethan for Jason's death. She must have forgotten that he jumped in front of a car to try and save him right in front of her, and spent 6 months in a coma as a result, but we're just backtracking now. Somehow the reporters get word that Sean is missing, and somehow manage to find Ethan's home and camp outside of it. I presume the police may give the press a daily briefing of current events, and yeah, I can buy that, but isn't it illegal to literally camp outside of someone's home in order to get a story? Isn't this harassment? Granted, I don't know the boundaries of reporting, but now I ask how the press somehow managed to get Ethan's address only 12 hours after his initial questioning was finished. I doubt police press briefings give out second-party addresses, and Mars isn't exactly an uncommon last name. Ethan starts questioning if he is the origami killer, and that comes completely out of left field, with only the more recent blackout and origami figures to reinforce the idea that he could be the killer, as it's only until much later that we learn that he's been having visions of people drowning and origami figures appearing for some time.
I'm the origami killer. I black out, and then the murdering starts. I know it's me.
If this had been shown, this moment would be understandable, but without a natural build-up, it feels like the concept appeared completely out of nowhere. Regardless of the small existential crisis of possibly being a killer, Ethan gets a letter containing a locker key. With no other option presented to both Ethan and the player, you leave the house and go see what's inside the locker. Arriving at the station, Ethan's fear of crowds starts to get the better of him, which leads into an interesting, if inconsequential scene. It's interesting in concept, since it could give us a better insight into how Ethan copes with his fear of crowds, but the appearance of Jason completely ruins the tone of this section. 1, Ethan's response to pretty much go after the hallucination doesn't make much sense, since Ethan already accepted Jason is dead and knows what he is seeing isn't real. It also reminds the player how annoying Jason was, and the appearance of the character doesn't add additional insight into either Ethan or Jason. If Jason was taken out, nothing would change in the bigger picture, and Ethan would go to the lockers anyway. He finds a shoebox before the scene fades to black. Ethan checks into a motel, opens the shoebox, and discovers that it contains origami figures, a cell phone, and a pistol, completely disregarding the metal detector and the security guard that's right next to the entrance of the locker area. The cell phone starts playing either a live feed or a pre-recorded video of Sean in a drain, before a message appears asking Ethan how far he is prepared to go to save his son. Through this, we learn that the origami killer is a bargain basement jigsaw killer. The origami figures are numbered, each with a different question that follows the "Are you prepared to do this to save your son?" format, followed by an address. The first address is a car lot, containing a vehicle to be used in Ethan's first test. The car has been there for 2 years, but I'm not bothered by the man out front not recognising Ethan as not the owner of the car. If you've worked in the same place for 2 years and have dealt with at least 20 clients at a time, it would be easy to forget faces, but I refuse to accept that the car has been locked up for 2 years. Considering other people have voluntarily followed Ethan's path before, it's amazing that Ethan is the first person to take this particular trial. The man out front kept the car in good condition by taking it for drives every month, while also servicing it. So what would happen if he put the GPS device on the handle and activated it? Granted, it's explained later that electronic devices linked to the killer can go cold, but having a battery power system stay still for 2 years risks the battery leaking and ruining it. It's a small nitpick, but when you complete the game, the whole 2-year storage aspect doesn't make sense, especially since the origami killer is able to purchase stolen cars. How much more sense would it make to park the car in a location symbolic to either the killer or Ethan, and have the note direct him there? The car could be at the house you lived in at the start of the game. It's another example of David Cage's inability to write a cohesive story. So Ethan is instructed to drive to a flyover overlooking a motorway, where he is told to drive on the wrong side of the road for 5 miles. Never mind the fact that the sequence itself is cartoonish in its execution, but the section demonstrated Cage's stubborn direction in the story. In every other trial, you can refuse in one way or the other, but in this trial, and to some degree in the next trial, there is no way you can refuse to attempt it. The option is there, but it's a trap. You have to do it in the end regardless. It's to make sure that the character injures himself to some capacity. In the next trial, you can only walk away after injuring yourself crawling through glass. So why do you have to go through this pain? So you can get healed up by Madison Paige, who is by far the most unnecessary character in the entire game, yet is the only character to have their own Wikipedia page. I am not kidding. So completing these trials awards you with a short clip of Sean, in addition to some letters and a hangman that presumably leads you to the boy. It's a neat way to motivate Ethan to partake in more trials, though one does question how much the origami killer planned. Like, regardless of what happens, the car crashes, but what if the locked glove box that contained the hangman pieces broke open, and Ethan essentially cheated by accident? Of course we know why that wouldn't happen. It's because no matter what happens, David Cage wants the story told his way. The first encounter with Madison is brief and has her work on his wounds before he takes a shower. They talk, Ethan can act coherently, and Madison leaves. Ethan's contribution to the scene is fine, though Madison's inclusion is problematic for reasons I'll get into later. Ethan then opens the second origami figure that directs him to a disused power plant. Now, I'm not an expert in power plant decommissioning since I wasn't very good at science and, I don't work in a power plant, but I am confident that government measures would ensure that the facility is completely cut off from the grid by removing the possibility that the power could be turned back on and make even the courtyard inaccessible by boarding up the surrounding area. Considering that not only the generators are turned on, but are emitting unsafe forks of electricity from presumably unstable condensers? Yeah, you would assume that the unsafe conditions would be acted upon. Ethan isn't even the first person to enter this facility, so it's surprising that not one person would report on the active station. It's been on for at least a few days. Someone would notice. So providing that you're able to climb through the condenser wires, Ethan is once again granted more letters in the hangman. If he fails and is electrocuted several times, he just leaves, completely disregarding the set of wires he already climbed through like it's nothing. Either way, he leaves, and upon his return to the motel, collapses. though we don't actually see it, but Madison arrives to help treat his wounds. Several hours pass if you successfully apply the treatment, before Madison once again leaves. Ethan picks up the third origami figure and sets off to his next test. Now, for all the crap I gave the previous two tests, this is the one that demonstrates the qualities of Quantic Dream when not under the heavy direction of David Cage. Ethan is told that he has to cut off a portion of his finger in front of the camera within 5 minutes, and even after knowing what is coming, it still makes me uncomfortable. Didn't help that my tool of choice was a pair of pliers, and that Pascal Langdale gave a terrific performance when Ethan experiences the pain. My only major concern for the chapter is in regards to the location and the key to enter, but those are concerns that only come in when analysing for this video. It's not something that instantly stands out, like the 2-year car lockup or the day's active power station. Ironically, when the test goes small scale in its design, it ends up arguably being an iconic chapter in gaming history. So Ethan completes the test, gets more letters to the hangman, and leaves the room. Except he cannot leave the building because of his delirious state, and that Madison once again shows up. She tells him that the police are outside, including Norman Jayden and Lieutenant Blake, and that they are prepared to arrest him. This section is fine on its own, and I did like the reincorporation of Ethan's fear of crowds, but the one thing that gets me is the police officer who aims their gun on you. There's a possibility I am wrong about this, but why doesn't the police officer fire a warning shot towards Madison and Ethan? I understand that warning shots are a legal grey area due to the possibility that the bullet might hit something, or someone, but the environment allows the officer to safely fire a warning shot. So why am I asking this? Because if Ethan doesn't cut off a section of his finger, the officer actually fires a shot that either hits Ethan's shoulder or the finger that was destined to be cut off. It is entirely dependent on your success in the previous tests, and I have to stress that the butterfly effect doesn't work that way! So if Ethan and Madison escape, they make it back to the motel room, where they learn that Ethan is the prime suspect in the origami killer case, thanks to the police looking into Ethan's estranged wife's suspicions. Madison is also a little suspicious, since every time she encounters Ethan, he's in a state of pain. Although one wonders why she is more than happy to continue helping him, even though he is likely the most wanted man in the country right now. Ethan even agrees with this, and tells Madison to leave and let him do what he has to do. The next thing he has to do is outright kill a guy with the gun that was in the shoebox. Of course, this is a rip-off Jigsaw, so the man is a drug dealer who at first mistakes Ethan as a drug addict. After an action sequence in which Ethan avoids getting shot by a shotgun, the two men come to the end of the fight in the daughter's room. Ethan holds the gun to the dealer's head, giving the player the choice to not kill him for the sake of his daughter. Yeah, no, that card isn't going to work on me, because I simply don't care about this character. David Cage's child characters exist to add artificial gravity to the situation, rather than be characters that contribute to the overall plot. It's funny that the child characters in his most famous works act more as anchors to both the player and the character, and sometimes it's downright offensive. What do these children, these daughters, contribute to the overall plot? That Ethan is on the fence about possibly denying a man an opportunity to see his kids again? Like his current situation? Maybe if the drug dealer was likable in some way and not the classic bad guy with a heart of gold, and maybe executed in the same way as The Walking Dead Season 1, then it might have worked. Yeah, remember Lee Everett? He killed a guy for sleeping with his wife. This incident is using children as a quick, lazy way to get the audience to connect with someone we've barely seen a minute of. The daughters exist to try and get us to feel sorry for this drug dealer. It doesn't work here, because not only are these girls not giving me a reason to care about them or their father, but also every single child in Heavy Rain is either irritating or has the worst voice actor assigned to them, thus making us expect the worst when a brief sight of a child appears. Oh yeah, minor tangent, Sean's voice acting is bad. Even in child acting standards, it's bad. Listen to this. This is Sean's reaction to encountering the possibility of drowning, death, the one thing his brother experienced only 2 years ago.
Help! Dad!
Sean.
Where are you? I'm so cold. Dad! Dad!
There's no crying in desperation, no tears as the possibility of being killed in one of the slowest, most painful ways possible, and the direction David Cage gave him can be accurately summed up as act as if you're bored. You couldn't find worse voice acting even if you tried. At least the voice acting in Silent Hill had a purpose, and Mind Jack is almost adorably bad in its execution.
I don't know what has happened. It is smoke began. The whole world is exploded.
Anyway, back to the motel, and Madison arrives to see Ethan distraught over the death of a drug dealer, or lamenting the fact that he didn't shoot him. One wonders why he didn't fire at the guy on his doorstep, but we'd be backtracking. Madison tells a shaken Ethan that she knows he isn't the origami killer. Despite the fact that the guy's son is drowning in a well somewhere, Madison leans in to kiss. You're given the choice to either reciprocate it and encounter one of the most laughable sex scenes in all of gaming, or reject her advances, and I can tell you, I could not hit that rejection button fast enough. Mainly because the romance is ham-fisted and crowbarred in. Sex and romance don't make a game mature, and Ethan's collective time with Madison equals maybe 25 minutes at best, during which he has been checked up on, twice, stalked, and watched while he slept for 3 hours. If you go through with the sex scene, you learn that Madison is really a photojournalist who somehow found where the electrocution trial was taking place, without an address or any information to go on. She apologizes, and you can either reject or accept it. This leads into another case of the butterfly effect not being incorporated correctly, because if it was, then the police would have burst through the door while the two were having their moment. The event is determined through game sequencing, not through clever and careful writing. A similar example would be Mass Effect 3's introduction, where the Normandy arriving is dependent on your ammo counter, and not on the amount of time you fought off your enemies. Regardless of what direction you take in arguably the worst romance in video game history, Ethan makes a valiant attempt to escape Lieutenant Blake, and ends up on the motel roof. He jumps off and hijacks a taxi, making his way to his 5th and final trial. Isn't it strange that the roads around the motel weren't cordoned off and a taxi was somehow able to casually nearly run over the person the police were trying to apprehend? Not trying to continuously repeat myself, but Ethan is a wanted serial child murderer, and a highly publicized one at that. How can an operation like this be handled in such a sloppy manner? There's incompetent police, then there's David Cage not asking basic questions about his script.
Holy fuck!
The last trial, and David Cage brings his artistic genius to the table. By which I mean the scene looks like a European artistic film that was unable to properly portray the symbolism. So basically a Lars von Trier film. The corridors and the White Room I can sort of get, since the final trial portrays the successful transition from someone distant from their son to going to great lengths to get to his son. A transition that falls flat when you consider that Ethan was having a good time with Sean and was repairing his relationship successfully immediately before the kidnapping. So tell me, viewer, what do the cameras pointing to Ethan represent? I'm being serious. Is it to show Ethan the person he has become, or is this another example of technology opening itself to pretension? If anything, the layout of the room with the cameras and the screens is nothing but over-designing something. Get rid of the cameras and screens, then you'd have something I believe would be more effective. After all, the best trial in the game was small scale, and didn't need anything too complex to be effective. So the trial is that you have to drink the poison to get the letters, and doing so will give you exactly 60 minutes to say goodbye to Sean. The origami killer must be one smart man because the effectiveness of poison is different from person to person. You can have him down the drink or leave to find Sean. If you fail to complete one trial out of the 5, you get into the vehicle, where you have to track down the kid using the letters obtained during the trials, and the footage of your son drowning. The big giveaway is a foghorn from a boat that's likely loud enough to blow the captain's ears out. It's not even subtle. Wouldn't it be better to use the faint sound of seagulls as the giveaway clue? Okay, maybe it's not that subtle, but it's a more realistic clue than a ferry horn that's that loud. And so we reach the end of Ethan's story. He sets off to whatever location you choose in the hopes you picked the right address, but before we get to that confrontation, we need to go through the other stories first, starting with Norman Jayden. I like Norman Jayden. He's an interesting character with a problem that's a recognisable trope, and he injects some much needed self-awareness into a world that severely needs it. The ARI system that serves as the primary gimmick was not only a smart way to make crime scene investigations less tedious, but also makes the drug addiction make sense in that technology needs a destructive counterbalance. I can confidently say that out of all the stories in the game, Jayden's is by far the best of the bunch. But that doesn't mean it's good. Jayden starts his story by arriving at the recent origami killer scene. It establishes the killer's modus operandi. He ditches his victims by railroad tracks, while leaving behind an orchid and an origami figure as some sort of apology. It's during this investigation where we meet Lieutenant Carter Blake, acting as lead investigator of the case. He seems reasonable enough, although that'll take a sharp turn during a later chapter. If you explore enough, you'll find tyre tracks next to a motorway. So far so good. Establish the grim tone, a core gameplay mechanic is taught, and a core character is introduced. The next chapter is also fine. It has Jayden getting settled into his new office and establishes his blatant misuse of ARI, and soon its consequences. What I like about this chapter is the introduction of the gold watch, and I feel that this is helped by being given the opportunity to tie Captain Perry's necktie. It establishes a sense of normalcy while also making the conversation with Perry more memorable than the watch. I think it's a smart scene, since what would become a vital clue doesn't present the telltale marks of it being so. It's also a noticeable scene that you neither forget nor remember. Welcome to the second of ARI's core mechanics, reviewing the clues and files and being able to unravel possible connections. In reality, you're just mashing two clues together and hope a revelation comes out of it, but the fact that this was included in the game, alongside it being fully voiced, is admirable and gives an interesting twist in investigating a case. After completing your first round of reviewing, the tryptocane addiction starts coming through. You can either give in to the addiction, or make your way to the bathroom. The only problem I really have is the camera angles and editing deceptively suggesting that the bathroom is on the other side of the precinct, not to the left of you. And there's also some writing inconsistencies caused by a lack of attention to detail. Like, why does the captain say cancel his afternoon appointments during the evening? It's easily forgiven, and it was only discovered when I was reviewing the footage. Same goes for the sunlight beam coming through the window, even though it's raining. After that scenario, we cut to Ethan reporting Sean missing, and Jayden taking part in the initial questioning should you not take the tryptocane. Major problems start arising during Jayden's presentation, when Lieutenant Carter Blake starts exhibiting an uncooperative and rude personality, yet we're not really given a reason why he is like this. I can get behind the fact that he might not like that Jayden is from the FBI, but by his own admission, a child's life is at stake. It's interesting that the captain doesn't dismiss him for his hostile behaviour towards the special investigator, because I'm fairly certain he'd get reprimanded for his behaviour if witnessed by any other captain. The key information to take from this presentation is that Carter Blake is an asshole for no real reason, and that it takes about 6 inches of rainfall before a child is killed. You have 3 days to find the boy. Fortunately, you have one lead, Nathaniel Williams, and you might have noticed that there is no way in hell he could be the killer. You quickly pick up from Jayden that the origami killer is an intelligent person, and Nathaniel is a crazy person whose motives in life would be inconsistent with the crime. Nathaniel is preparing for the end of the world by hanging up crucifixes all over his apartment, and he barely cleans up. Someone relying on faith without effort doesn't strike to me as someone who could organise what Ethan went through. But that's okay, because it serves more as character reinforcement for Jayden and Blake, except whether or not you shoot Nathaniel doesn't matter and doesn't have long-term consequences. In fact, the only consequence there is for shooting him is just a variation of dialogue that Blake spouts out.
Why didn't you shoot?
If his rash behaviour was justifiable, then I'd be on board with Blake, like the exhaustion and guilt he feels over his failure to catch the killer is haunting him. At least following procedure would make his character more believable.
Call the cops.
Unfortunately, for most of Jayden's levels, you're going to have to deal with this one-note character, and witness missed opportunities for him to develop realistically. Take the next level, the covered market for example. On my first attempt, I was battered into oblivion by Corda before getting saved by Blake. It would have been an interesting moment for Blake, but instead it's used as a lifeline in case you fail the combat sequence. No consequence for your failure, just the false sense that Jayden is about to die. One wonders where the hell Blake was for the entire chase, and must have been shadowing Jayden considering he found him in the freezer. Also, and this is a minor nitpick, but who the hell brings live chickens to a market? So the investigation leads to nowhere, as presumably Nathaniel is let go and Corda has a solid alibi for the murders, but a major development is hinted at when none other than Grace Mars shows up to tell the police a story. It's a story that makes little sense for both the player and the character, a classic sign that this is David Cage writing we're dealing with. Now, I want to stress that in a police investigation, every word is pretty much analysed and taken into consideration. If there's even a slight discrepancy, then it's likely going to be a highlight for suspicion. This is why, when it comes to crime productions, special attention needs to be taken in order to make the crimes and questioning make sense. With that established, let's talk about Grace Mars's visit.
It was a few months back.
That directly contradicts what Ethan said about the separation, which was 6 months ago. The game takes place in October, and it is established in the game's art assets that all the killings take place during the fall season.
There is always a railroad line adjacent to where the bodies are found. And all the victims disappeared in the fall.
So when she mentions that the next morning there was a report of another child being found, why doesn't Jayden instantly dismiss the story as completely unrelated, since it doesn't match up with the recent victim's estimated death date? Ever heard of the term idiot plot? It's where everything in the story could have been solved if people didn't act like idiots and acted like humans instead. The reason why I'm harping on about this is because if it wasn't for Grace Mars's inconsistent and suspicious story, Jayden and Blake wouldn't have immediately gone to the shrink featured in Ethan's story and beaten the information out of him, instead of once again getting reprimanded after at least the third case of misconduct in under 24 hours. Blake comes to the conclusion that Ethan Mars is the origami killer. Awfully convenient that the story Grace told is based on cut content and matches up with evidence given under duress. So instead of making attempts to call Ethan in for questioning, Blake puts out an APB and says, outright, that Ethan Mars is the origami killer.
Yes, Ethan Mars is the origami killer.
Why not say prime suspect? What evidence does he have against Ethan? That he's been having blackouts since the death of his son? That he's been having visions of drowning during the summer period and not during the previous rainy seasons? Wasn't he in a coma when the first victims showed up? Actually, speak of the devil, it's awfully convenient that these chapters aren't labelled with a definitive date, otherwise the detectives would have looked up how long Ethan had been in a coma to see if he has a solid alibi. Hell, if I'm trusting the wiki, Jason died on or a few days after his birthday, which admittedly I can't find the source of, which would mean that Ethan's 6-month-long coma would give him a solid alibi for the first murder. Instead, Ethan Mars is a target for Blake, and they find him after he encountered the lizard trial. Cue Ethan and Madison getting away via the subway. Fortunately, Jayden isn't too much of an idiot to say Ethan Mars is the origami killer, though it's more to do with the fact that his life doesn't match with Jayden's psychographic profile, alongside the fact that it doesn't make sense for someone to kill 8 kids before going after his own son, instead of contradictory testimonies, but we're just harping on about that now. New evidence in the form of surveillance footage lands itself in Jayden's possession, of a car matching the tyre prints passing by the park in the time window when Sean Mars was kidnapped. Interestingly, the police don't investigate the building Ethan and Madison escaped from, which contains a tablet that likely has some evidence on it. They don't even examine the building records to find a lead. that's left for Madison, and oh yes, I'll get to that soon. The evidence gives Jayden a small lead to a man called Mad Jack, who was known for stealing and selling cars, but a lack of evidence kept him out of jail for the case of this particular stolen vehicle. With no other leads, and now with Ethan's life on the line, Jayden heads out to find Mad Jack, although he is briefly diverted by withdrawal. So we arrive at the junkyard to have a talk with Mad Jack, and immediately I have a problem with it. So I get that Lieutenant Blake already has his eyes set on Ethan Mars, but wouldn't it benefit him if he found more evidence that would link Ethan to the crime? A sane jury would want to talk about how the boy disappeared and what car was used, so wouldn't tracing the car lead to more concrete evidence? And even if he wasn't looking for more evidence, it would be foolish for Jayden to go alone and without notice. Jayden's thoughts tell us that Blake wasn't in the office, but that doesn't excuse him for at least trying to get in touch with him, or bringing in a partner who can verify his actions and give him some security. Mad Jack has a history of crime, and he isn't scrawny. You could say he's pretty jacked. So yeah, Jayden's an idiot for going alone, especially since Mad Jack has a skull inside an acid bath. If you do try to leave without seeing the skull, Mad Jack will just tell Jayden that he sold the car to the killer, and that he plans to kill Jayden for snooping around. It's pretty pathetic writing, and while I do really like some aspects of this chapter, it does show David Cage's direction of thinking. Like, it's pretty obvious that the path he wants us to go down involves finding the skull, because it seems like the one that has more flow to it, instead of it nonchalantly admitting that, yeah, the origami killer has been here to buy a car and that Mad Jack got it sprayed for him.
One of your cop buddies asking too many questions. I had to solder up his little mouth. Now that car, she buff up real good. I painted her dangerous blue, in honor of the dangerous motherfucker that was driving her.
It would have been much better if he pointed the gun at Jayden and said something like, "You've been snooping around too much," or "You cops irritate me," or something to that effect, not admitting all the crimes he was hiding like he was reading it off a piece of paper. Regardless, you and Mad Jack fight each other until you come out on top. Jack is uncooperative at first, but does tell you that while he didn't know the man who bought the car, he did sell that particular vehicle. The origami killer requested a new car with false plates, before dropping a note to a guy called Paco, who, interestingly enough, is voiced by the same actor as Mad Jack. Pretty diverse portfolio. Jayden attempts to arrest Mad Jack, but the withdrawal symptoms interfere before he can arrest him. This actually leads into another neat design decision. If you complete the incredibly difficult button sequence, you arrest Mad Jack without a problem. If you fail to do so, you're knocked out by Mad Jack and forced to fight for your life in a sequence that I found to be really well done, even though the point where Mad Jack dies is almost comical. I like it because it shows an appropriate consequence for a failure to do an incredibly difficult action that doesn't involve the character instantly dying. The problem is Mad Jack's method of killing Jayden, and the difference in detail between the two paths. It's obvious that David Cage only gave the action sequence any amount of attention and care, because the other option, where you arrest Mad Jack, feels so jarring when you know that he's a monster. It didn't help that there was no real consequence in arresting him, so he can't admit to selling the stolen car to a guy who isn't Ethan Mars. How awfully convenient. In addition, why did Mad Jack try to dispose of Jayden using a car crusher, when it's clear that he has no qualms in getting bloody? After all, he admitted to killing another cop and dumping their body in an acid bath, so why not do the same to Jayden? To be fair, I initially wrote that I did like this chapter as a whole, but after analysing it, it comes with a caveat that I like it if you go down only one of 4 possible paths. So your only lead to possibly finding the origami killer is in a club called the Blue Lagoon, and as soon as Norman Jayden arrives at Paco's office, he finds Paco dead, but the killer is in the same office. The two of you fight, and if successful, the origami killer leaves. And yeah, this is the real origami killer, something you can confirm if you find the orchid pollen if you survive this encounter.
Orchid pheromones. The fucking origami killer.
So if the killer was trying to kill anyone who could possibly find him, why does he leave Jayden alive? He has a gun, which not many people can hear since Paco's security didn't suspect a thing, and he tried to kill him with a load of other weapons only seconds before. Kill him with the samurai sword! Well, the good news is that between Mad Jack's information, Madison's information that I'll get to later, and the fact that Paco was just killed, suggests to us, the player, that Paco was the origami killer's resource man. So tell me, why did it have to be the origami killer that personally bought the car from Mad Jack? Why couldn't Paco? That would mean if something went wrong, you'd only have a single man to kill in order to make the trail go cold. It's not as if the police are doing an effective job, given their priorities aren't aligned with any rational system known to real police departments. I mean, Paco could be the guy that did get the car, but this wasn't conveyed clearly if that was the case. Regardless, you're unable to get information on the man, but the security guard does give you a name, John. It's not relevant for the rest of this story. The crucial clues you get are the 2 receipts that Tiari's system won't pick up, a weapon that later transpires was supposed to be in the possession of the police, and the fight itself, since Ari recorded the entire fight. After investigating, Jayden leaves. Time is running out. Ethan Mars just escaped from police custody, Sean is close to drowning, and Carter is dead set on sending Jayden away. Fortunately, the clues I mentioned earlier do give you the crucial information needed to find Sean. On one hand, I really liked the foreshadowing with the Golden Watch, which I talked about earlier, but it's undercut by the fact that the camera lingers on the same watch for far too long, turning it from a aha moment to a yeah, we get it moment.
Gold watch. I'm sure I've seen this before somewhere. The watch they give for promotions to lieutenant. The killer is a cop.
Of course, since lieutenants get golden watches, it would be right to accuse Carter Blake for being the killer, and you have that option, although it's an option that's more or less pushed onto you. You don't have to do it, and thankfully the game gives us the option to not go through with it. If you do go through with it, it doesn't end well, and effectively the Jayden story is over. But if you investigate further, you find the one person who not only has the watch, but also lives close to the gas station that matches the receipts. Those receipts being the crucial clue was actually pretty good, and while I do complain about some aspects of Jayden's story, the investigation sections where you piece together the clues are something I genuinely enjoyed, even if the control scheme is a little arduous. However, even with the investigation aspect and the results you can get from it, what kind of killer directly earns the property they commit murders in? Especially considering they've got someone under their influence who could own it under their name. Not only that, we established that the origami killer was using the name John to accomplish some specific things. So why is the warehouse holding Sean and the flat he lives in owned under one name and not the 2 separate names? Think about this. If Paco had been a suspect in the case, and it was established that Jayden doesn't buy Ethan Mars as the killer, how much more sense would it make for Jayden to look at Paco's properties and discover that one of them would fit his hypothesis? You could have used the knowledge you gained throughout the game in regards to locations and figure out the most probable location Sean is held in. Unfortunately, what we are left with is the location of Sean about 2 seconds after discovering which police lieutenant is the origami killer.
Cop. There's only one cop in that geoprofiling zone. Gotcha. He owns a warehouse on the docks. If I'm wrong, Sean Mars is dead.
With this knowledge, Jayden leaves to find Sean. Jayden's story is by far the most interesting and the least flawed perspective in the game, but that is down to the fact that the story and gameplay is a lot more engaging. The detective aspect where you find clues is rough since it was one of the first few games to implement a system like this onto consoles, but jumping between this game and LA Noire isn't that jarring. It helps that Jayden's story drags us into more interesting situations, despite it competing with someone going through budget jigsaw trials, and was able to be complicated in the investigation's presentation without it getting too complex. But it's bogged down by some of the same things that affect Ethan's story, mainly that the writing is led by David Cage. Character motivations and actions make little sense, dialogue is very stilted, and the game's events hinge on every single character, Jayden included, having some sense of idiocy. Like I said before, it's the best story of the 4 characters, but it's far from good. And since Jayden's story has been completed sans the last level, let's move on to Scott's story. Scott Shelby is a private investigator hired by the families of the Origami Killer's victims to try and find the killer. Yeah, that's something I can buy into, considering the police's incompetence, though we don't see that yet, since chronologically this chapter takes place after Ethan puts Sean to bed. His first stop is a prostitute called Lauren Winter, mother of a victim of the Origami Killer. Not too recent for her to have a complete breakdown or be in full mourning, but certainly recent enough for her to be suffering since the killings only started 2 years ago. Obviously, Lauren needs some talking into in order to talk about a very traumatic part of her life, and if you succeed in doing so, you'll get some information about the day Lauren's son disappeared, his father, and the son in general. If you fail to get her talking, you're asked to leave. You can put Scott's card on the table and leave, or just leave. Either way, Scott has an asthma attack on the way out, approximately the same time when an abusive client arrives. Now, some of you might be wondering why I don't have a problem with the client's arrival being dictated by code, and not actual timing, and the answer to that is perspective. You see, there's a fundamental difference between a sex scene fading to black and just leaving the building. Fading to black implies that quite a bit of time has passed, so the police's arrival being dictated by Madison seeing them is less believable than Shelby having an asthma attack. Simply put, it's easier to suspend your disbelief when replaying the game if the time difference of the events triggered are small. So yeah, you can be the White Knight and beat up the guy, or you can leave Lauren to the abusive client. It won't make a difference in the big picture, since this is the only time you see the guy, and Lauren will show up at your door a few chapters later. In fact, she'll show up regardless of if you give her your business card or not. Next stop, Hassan's shop. Largely the same thing, though you'll get the information you're looking for after the interference. Instead of the order of chapters being a hindrance, for this particular chapter it's actually a benefit because it foreshadows something that comes up in the next few chapters. You're introduced to the cardboard box that Ethan will soon get, and once you see what's in the box, it actually tells more about Hassan's character. Overall, pretty decent chapter that I didn't have much of a problem with. Same can pretty much be said about Suicide Baby, and demonstrates the immediate reaction a family can have when the Origami Killer strikes. The father leaves without notice, and results in nothing but grief for all affected. While the Origami Killer's modus operandi and structure in which he strikes is well established at that point, it was nice to see a different perspective that was almost as fresh as Ethan's. Really, my only issue with the level is an issue I have with a lot of the game's levels in general, a combination of the accelerator-based tank controls and a horrible camera system. There's motion controls, which throughout the game are very irritating, and make a perfect example of why 6-axis controllers don't suit serious-toned, adult-oriented games that focus on the story. What you learn from this visit is that the electronic devices that the Origami Killer uses die out shortly after they are activated, so the cell phone that was sent to the father in this case is no longer active. Shelby takes it as a clue, and leaves the injured mother alone with her daughter. So with Shelby's investigation ongoing, he goes back to his office to get some rest before he hears a call at his front door. Who should it be but Lauren Winter with something that might be helpful for Scott's investigation. He gets an envelope containing an address written on an old typewriter, which could lead to a suspect, but he gets the clue under one condition, that Lauren becomes his partner until the killer is found. Once again, a game about choice takes your choice away. Lauren becomes your partner. First stop, a party with more girls and coke than an A-lister's private residence. It's in this chapter that major problems with the writing and direction show. I understand that the overall goal of this scene is to establish Gordy Kramer as a suspect, while also casting doubt on his confession, but the cinematography and delivery make it impossible to take it seriously. There's no depth of field or sinister lighting setup to establish the tone, using only the film code minier to give Gordy childlike traits. It certainly does that, but Gordy's line delivery is flat and inconsistent, going from deadpan to Krusty the Clown with the drop of a hat.
Do you know who my father is?
Get rid of this clown!
Also, I should point out that this is the only chapter we see Gordy, since the role of antagonist is given to Gordy's father, Charles. So taking him seriously as a suspect is made impossible, since he's a forgettable character in the bigger picture of the game. Charles Kramer has more character to him, he has believable traits and is an okay villain with some complexity. He's a family man who likes golf, smart but willing to dabble into corruption, while having some guilt over something I'll get into later. He's not the villain, but he's someone who is interested in the role of possible suspect. He invites Scott over to essentially tell him to stop his investigation into the origami killer, since it's putting his son and the family's name into jeopardy. But of course, that doesn't work. Gordy's confession is a major lead in the investigation, and it's not like a reasonable person would drop a child murder case due to the insistence of a suspect's father. Scott's next stop is at an old friend's business in order to analyse the letters of a typewriter. While I'm not one to say that there is such a thing as typewriter experts outside of Tom Hanks, what I like about this level is the need to memorise every surface both you and Lauren touch. It's something that is relatively difficult to do, and while not succeeding will only lead to a superficial consequence, its inclusion is one I feel was necessary. The fact that the brand of typewriter is rarely used and brought in for service is a nice touch, since it makes the scope of the investigation clearer when it comes to our characters analysing both the customer invoices and an origami magazine mailing list. Fun fact, origami magazines actually exist. Well, I think it's neat. So Manfred goes to the back to get the invoice list before he suddenly winds up dead, killed by the origami killer. The police were called and are on their way, and the last thing Scott and Lauren want is to waste time in a police station. Cue cleaning up the surfaces before leaving. Unless you miss something, and in which case you end up at the station. Personally, I think it's too quick for the police to brush the place down, bring in one of their former lieutenants and send him home within the span of 4 hours, but what the hell do I know about forensics? I'll give some credit. The dynamic between Shelby and Carter was interesting, considering I know what is coming next, but it's written in a way so that you can interpret it as Shelby trying to avoid giving evidence to inept officers. So after having an argument with Lauren in which she nearly attempts to crash the car, the two of you go back home to look at some evidence, and looking between the mailing list and Manfred's ledger gives out a name. Weird that the origami killer would be part of an origami magazine mailing list, except for the fact that John Shepard, the connecting name, is long dead. No, seriously, John Shepard is dead. You visit his grave to check that he's actually dead, during which Lauren and Scott rudely yell in a cemetery. Though, to be fair, that's more due to my ineptitude than intended events. Still, Lauren's remark is tasteless.
Did anyone ever tell you shouldn't shout in a cemetery?
Take it easy, the dead don't mind.
John Shepard is actually dead, as confirmed by the caretaker, but someone has been leaving flowers and origami figures on his grave. Flowers I can get, but origami figures would set off alarm bells. It seems obvious that the person tending to the grave brings both, and as the backstory goes, an unnamed suspect gets added to the list, alongside Gordy Kramer. The caretaker tells the story of when John Shepard died, and if you thought Sean's voice acting was bad, how about a child actor whose native language is French?
What are we gonna do? It's pouring rain. John's right. We can't just stand here all day. Being out in the rain is nothing compared to being in when he's like that. The construction site is empty. Makes for a great playground. I am scared. If he can do it, I can do it.
I know this is supposed to be a defining moment in this storyline, but the horrific voice acting makes it near unbearable. I'll give Cage credit for having the decency to cast children in a serious toned game, but who in the right mind would cast French kids to play Americans? Okay, maybe you can find some who can speak and act American fluently, but as someone who did acting at a very young age, it's easy to slip back into your native accent unless you have some tight direction. And as we've established before, David Cage directs as well as Uwe Boll. Has every child actor in this production been given poor direction? Fun fact, there's 3 child actors in this game. One of them is exclusively the motion capture actor, and both voice actors perform terribly. I know the other voice actors have performed inconsistently throughout the whole game, but at least they have the knowledge to at least try to salvage their roles. So yeah, John Shepherd dies after drowning in a construction yard. Though I don't know who is more at fault. The parents for being negligent, the construction company for awful security measures, or the kids for being idiots. Actually, how did John get his foot stuck in the pipe anyway? The current of the water looks strong enough to at least push debris down the pipe. Could the art team at least slow the visuals down, since it looks like John isn't struggling against the current?
Move your ass, I'm waiting.
And there you have it. John Shepherd has a twin who was later adopted. With the investigation now at a dead end, Shelby and Lauren leave, but not before we see Charles Kramer place flowers upon John Shepherd's grave. Interesting how Charles Kramer, who dismissed Gordy as the origami killer, would put flowers on John Shepherd's grave. Does this mean he is apologising for him or his son using John's name to cover up their tracks? Once again, a good build of intrigue. Later, Scott comes home to find Lauren in his apartment. Don't worry, unlike a lot of Cage's writing, this does get explained. And Kramer with a metaphorical and literal gun to their heads. Now, I can understand Scott getting into trouble, and it's possible his name is in the phone book, but how did Kramer successfully track Lauren down? It's not like hookers openly advertise on billboards, and it's safe to say she's closed until further notice. Turns out Scott's digging is becoming more and more of a concern to Kramer, so the appropriate action is to kill the two of them. By drowning. Again, why not shoot them, then dump their bodies in the car and body of water later? Not like they're trying to make the drowning look like an accident, their hands are tied up! Of course, like Jayden when he's against Mad Jack, we escape and bring Lauren back to the surface. Their days are likely numbered in single digits unless something is done, so Scott tells Lauren to lock herself up in her home instead of giving Lauren the money to rent a hotel or something. Scott asks for her car and sets off to get things sorted. So many of you might be thinking, why don't I consider Scott's story to be the strongest of the lot? After all, I've criticised it less than Jayden's and Ethan's story, and my overall concerns focus on very specific parts and concerns over story delivery. In fact, I've given this story quite a bit of praise in terms of intrigue and execution, but why do I think this takes the bronze medal in the 4-person race? The answer is the very next chapter. Ladies and gentlemen, what you have witnessed is the worst sequence in the game that doesn't involve Madison, because while the first, second, and fourth trials are so stupid in their setup and execution, It wasn't this stupid. They at least didn't jar too much from the storyline's established tone, and it was at least consistent with what the character has been shown to be able to do. You know why I can be on board with the fourth trial despite the horrid execution? Because Ethan Mars is running away from the guy with the shotgun. Take a look at Shelby's previous chapters. You have a couple of action sequences that were brief and wasn't the crux of the whole thing. All of them close quarters, and using only his fists. It wasn't precise shooting and using literal auto-aim. This was a fat police detective going in and killing everyone in his path just to get some answers. Any connection we have with this character breaks because he killed some guys that showed up to work on the wrong day. For all they know, this guy is a maniac who holds a grudge against Kramer, and from Scott's actions, they think he's the bad guy in this feud. I'll get to that. If anyone should be in this situation, it should be Norman Jayden, because he works for the FBI, as well as suffering from withdrawals, and thus we can buy into his rampage should he go on one. So you get to Charles Kramer, who, after assaulting him, comes clean about the whole thing. Gordy isn't the killer, but he did kill one of the kids who was listed as an origami killer victim. Somehow he kidnapped and killed a child, and instead of sending his psychotic despot of a son to a facility, Charles frames the incident on the origami killer to cover his tracks. He then says that no one will miss the dead child since he was a street urchin, before sympathetically telling Scott that he feels guilty over John Shepard's death. He owned the construction site. Now, I'm not an expert writer. Hell, my scripts are looked through and suggestions are made, but the tone of Kramer shouldn't jump from sad to snarky to sad in the span of a minute or two. Even the most basic of writers would put the street urchin comments right before Kramer has a heart attack. Then again, we're talking about a David Cage script, someone who isn't even a good writer, yet is hailed as an icon due to a game that, as we've discovered, isn't very good. You know what's more insulting than the entire chapter? You get the choice between throwing Kramer to the left or right, and no matter what happens, you'll throw him to the left. Why give us that choice when it doesn't even matter, even in the short term? So Kramer knows John Shepard's twin got adopted, but he doesn't know who by, and that the mother will likely know since the father is probably still drinking. As Scott leaves, we have the choice to either save him or leave him to die. Honestly, I decided to save him on my recent playthrough, because I know it's what David Cage would want. But why does Kramer feel less guilty about a kid his son killed in the last 2 years to the point of insulting him, than a kid who shouldn't be running around in a construction yard to begin with? So yeah, that happened, and Scott sends Lauren away for her safety. The two kiss, and we see terrible child actors again. Seriously, listen to this. The kid can't hide the French twang, and if they can't hide that, don't bring them into your production!
I've gotta get Dad! He's the only one who can save John! Gotta move!
So we look into the flashback a bit further from where we left off, where we discover French-American twin trying to get his father to help. The father, drunk, tells him to scram, and thus doesn't come to save John. With no one able to help him, not even the twin, John resigns to his fate, with his last words being,
Don't forget about this guy.
And with that knowledge, we cut back to Scott. With Lauren gone and Kramer now dealt with, he begins to destroy the evidence. The box he got from Hassan, Lauren's envelope, the phone from Susan Boyles, some evidence he stole from Manfred while killing him. Oh yeah, he killed Manfred and set him and Lauren up. An address book from Paco's office, and a photograph of him and John from his mother's hospital bed. Scott Shelby is the origami killer. When I originally played Heavy Rain, I thought the twist was quite good. The fact that you're collecting evidence to destroy while trying to uncover a copycat killer was a good swerve, and upon replaying it, there's some good and bad things when looking at this twist in the bigger picture. As a person who likes small details, it was nice that David Cage at least attempted to give French Scotty some symptoms of asthma. And remember that part where we suddenly start with Scott entering his office? That takes place after the confrontation with Jayden, but it's something you don't know unless you inspect it further. This is what replaying a game centered around mystery and story should be about, a second playthrough being more rewarding when you find the foreshadowing hints. So, big question. If Scott is the origami killer, why does he not do actions that'll cover his tracks? Well, the game does acknowledge that and gives you an achievement if you perform specific actions that do just that. You can have Hassan killed by the robber, let Norman die in the confrontation so he doesn't collect evidence, kill Kramer when he has his heart attack, and drown Lauren when you're thrown into the body of water. Doesn't explain why the police didn't get their hands on Susan Boyles' phone, but the fact that the game gives you the option to let Scott win and get away with it is something to be admired. Unfortunately, with the good comes the bad, and I'll start off with the asthma. There's a little something in storytelling called the Rule of Three, where you establish something, reinforce it, then pay it off. Another example is Chekhov's gun, where something prominent is established, then pays off much later. But Heavy Rain seems to try and use the Rule of Three on asthma, but there isn't a payoff. In the first chapter, Scott has an asthma attack in the middle of a corridor. He has to use his inhaler to be back in the right condition. In the next chapter, his asthma is reinforced by him requesting a new inhaler after Hassan initially turns him down. You walk up to grab the inhaler before the robber comes in. Established, reinforced. Unfortunately, there is no payoff, and in the next chapter, his thoughts just say the asthma isn't a concern.
Asthma free for the moment, lovely. Got an old inhaler in my pocket, just in case.
You could interpret the short breaths young Scott takes as just being out of breath in general. And didn't Scott mow down several people without a hint of asthma? How good would it be to the narrative and to the player if the receipt Jayden can find was for an asthma inhaler? The revelation takes place after Jayden pieces together the clues, so you'd probably need to only change a few lines of dialogue. It would be a satisfying payoff, and the player would pat themselves on the back in solving the case at the same time Jayden did, thus connecting the player to the character. And now, on to the bigger problems. Why the hell did he subscribe to an origami magazine under the John Shepard name? Pretty sure the internet exists, and YouTube or other video sites would be a thing. Why would he use his own name to purchase the warehouse Sean is held in? Has he been using the same warehouse to drown the other boys? What would happen if the police managed to find one of the other boys in the same warehouse for any reason? They would just have to check out who owned the place and boom, caught the killer. And speaking of property, where the hell did he get the money from to not only purchase the warehouse, but to also fund the upkeep of 2 cars, rent a burnt out property, rent a nicely kept property, buy several cameras, several televisions, several tablets, input cards, and possibly other cars given his business with Mad Jack and Paco? Is he on a ridiculously large pension, or did he take out a really large loan? How was he able to learn how to tailor technology for specific times and uses? Did he send Packer to Manfred to repair a specific model of typewriter? Because it's clear that of the 10 years Manfred has been aware of Scott's existence, he didn't send the typewriter in for repairs personally. How come Lauren didn't immediately get suspicious of Scott the second he mentioned the word typewriter? There's one on his desk, right there! Was he counting on Kramer not calling the police after Scott broke into his house, killed a security detail, and assaulted him? How was he able to get the broken glass down the tunnel Ethan has to crawl through? Because he's fat! How did he get the means to activate the electricity in an abandoned power plant and not raise anyone's attention? How many guns has he managed to smuggle through the metal detector without attracting any attention? Or is it a trial specifically tailored for Ethan? Why the hell does he wear the same watch that would tie him to not only the police department, but a specific station with a specific rank achieved? Dead giveaway if someone manages to film a confrontation, like what happened with Jayden. Here's what gets me. Later we find out that Scott started his killing spree after witnessing Ethan try and fail to save Jason. Of all the people to target for his messed up bargain bucket jigsaw games, why Ethan, when it's clear he's not negligent and was actually doing what he could to repair his relationship with Sean? He witnessed Ethan preparing to die to save Jason 2 years prior. Wouldn't that disqualify him from needing to take part in these games? He's still depressed after losing his 10-year-old son 2 years ago. Let's kidnap his other son to teach him how to be a better dad. even though Ethan has been quite a reasonable father given the circumstances and his coma. Speaking of, did he stalk Ethan and plant an origami figure in his hands when he has his blackouts? Why doesn't he use a discontinued police car for his kidnappings instead of a civilian car? You can get those fairly cheaply in Miami, given the abundance of money he has to the point that he has a walk-in fridge inside his apartment. They're pretty expensive to upkeep, you know. Jesus Christ. So that's the end of Scott's storyline, minus the final chapter and one other chapter. But before we finish, let's look at the worst part of the entire game. Madison Paige. Okay, you're going to have to forgive me if I start getting furious in this section. But Madison Paige's story is bad. Really bad. Awful. Unbearable. A storyline that would have benefited from being cut completely. Every time she appears, it makes me groan, because every scene she is in exposes not only how awful David Cage is as a writer, but how much of a creep he is when it comes to him and his female characters. It's worse in Beyond Two Souls, but some of the same problems exist here. She is there to be exploited as a sex object, if not in the direct way, then in a really messed up way, and pretty much the only times she isn't are examples of poor planning, bad writing, and game design that makes previous choices utterly meaningless, as the result can negate all the effort put into the trials and the investigation sequences. She's the only character in Heavy Rain with a fucking Wikipedia page, and has been set up as an example of a strong female in gaming, and I kind of wish people and publications would stop doing that, because Debbie Does Dallas has better examples of strong female characters over this woman in David Cage's tripe.
My, Mr. Greenfield, how big you are.
Want an example of her being unnecessary and an element that should be cut? Her first chapter takes place after Sean is kidnapped and reported missing, and Scott's visit to Hassan's shop. So, 2 hours into the game, after firmly establishing Ethan, Jayden, and Scott as central characters, suddenly Madison shows up to explore her nice apartment in her pants, and get a shower in which we see uncensored boobs. Fun fact, Sony were reluctant to have Madison's breasts out not only once, but twice. Obviously, they still made the final cut. David Cage lamented this, saying that it's a shame because Madison has a really great body. Just going to let that quote sink in for a moment. Oh yeah, and she fights off the attackers in her pants, and as she's about to get killed, she wakes up to discover that it's all a dream. So what was the point of the whole scene? To say that Madison's an insomniac? Hey, earth to David Cage. I've had bad dreams about people about to kill me, and I woke up in a shocked state. I'm pretty sure many other people have too. Not only that, but the fact that this scene takes place so far into the game feels jarring, especially when every other character and their unique story is established within the first 30 minutes. Not only that, but you don't see her again until about an hour later. Or 8 chapters later if you want specifics. To fight her insomnia, she checks in at the same motel as Ethan, and she encounters the creepy receptionist.
Hello there, sweetheart. What can I do for you?
She's on her way to her room when you encounter Ethan, having completed his first trial. You escort him to his room and assist him with the injuries sustained. He hops in the shower, and while she wisely tells him to keep talking so that he doesn't go into shock, she can also view him getting undressed and getting in the shower. Okie dokie. So he finishes the shower and she leaves, after learning his name. 30 minutes of playing time later, she leaves her motel room to observe the outside in the ongoing rain. There, she finds Ethan again, and again she heals his wounds, except he passes out, leaving her to watch him sleep for about 3 hours. Oh, and he's shirtless. Getting a really creepy vibe here, even if it's meant to be endearing. There's an option to tell Ethan that her helping him is in relation to fixing her brothers up, and that apparently explains why she chose to fix him up. She asks to help him, but he asks her to leave, and thanks her for her trouble. She leaves. She then shows up at the lizard trial. Like, at the actual building itself after it's been completed. And despite knowing absolutely nothing about Ethan's trials and his connection to the origami killer, she helps him escape the police for no reason at all. This includes carrying Ethan through the streets, through the crowd, and across the train tracks.
What the hell am I doing, helping a fugitive escape? I must be completely out of my mind.
This doesn't make any rational sense. She barely knows the guy, but he comes back to the motel with more injuries for her to treat. Think about this for a second. You just met someone in a motel and have nursed him back to health twice. Would you follow him inside an abandoned building surrounded by police? For all you know, he could be a criminal, and when the news states that Ethan Mars is the prime suspect to the origami killer case, she still helps him! That makes her complicit, since she lets the prime suspect escape the police. And you want to know what her reason is for following Ethan?
I wanted to know.
How did she know where to find him? That trial took several minutes to complete, and she arrived at the building when he started leaving. There's no address to go on, and before anyone says that she might have read the origami lizard to find the address, when Ethan leaves the motel room, the door firmly closes. You ever been to a motel? You can only open those if you have the key. Also, the police must be doing a really bad job if, even when in civilian cars, a random woman knows that it's the police.
The police. They staked out the building where Ethan is.
She just shows up and starts helping him for no logical reason. It's a chapter of convenience that serves to demonstrate that Ethan is, indeed, being hunted by the police. You want to know what happens if Madison wasn't around or didn't exist? The game would continue as usual, and Ethan would get arrested. It would cut to a previously unmentioned chapter that wouldn't exist unless Ethan was taken in, and I highly recommend playing this chapter. Even though it has a lot of problems, like why hasn't Jayden taken the footage from the camera and shown it to his superiors so Blake and Perry would get suspended immediately, or why Jayden would immediately think about releasing Ethan without consulting the FBI, it adds a much needed element to the lack of Jayden's suspicion of Ethan, and would add additional satisfaction to two of the possible endings. Personally, it would have been interesting if he got authorization from the FBI to sneak Ethan out, therefore establishing that not everyone in a position of authority is a complete idiot.
Say something, for God's sake!
Anyway, back to Madison and her hair-pulling plot. Madison admits that every single cop in the country will be wanting his head, and when Ethan says something along the lines of, "I don't know if I'm the killer or not and I might be testing myself," Madison continues to support Ethan. Ethan wisely tells her to leave, and she does. So while Ethan is out killing a drug dealer, Madison uses her journalism connections to somehow find the address of the apartment owner before the police. Considering the DNA and technology evidence prevalent in the apartment, you'd think that a competent police force would wonder who owns the property and who uses the property. In this case, the owner of the property is an Adrian Baker, who was struck off the medical register after doing a stint in prison for drug dealing. The conversation with Madison and Baker is as subtle as a piano falling off a cliff, with the drink Adrian gives you obviously drugged, combined with Madison's need to know who rented the apartment being delivered as if you're a really bad police informant.
I was looking for something around Marble Street.
After some time and getting no answers, Adrian leaves to get Madison some boxes of pills. Here, the story can go in two ways. You can find what you need by seeing a Blue Lagoon card with the name Paco on it, because that means something, or you can get knocked out and encounter this. So, Madison is tied up on a table, and the doctor misses practicing surgery, so he's obviously going to perform some on Madison to make up for what he lost. He nonchalantly says that the property was rented to Paco at the Blue Lagoon, before proceeding to try and stick a cordless drill in her special triangle. David Cage, don't want to sound like a broken record, but you are a creep. Not only does Baker announcing that Paco rented the apartment come off as a way to conveniently get a character from one place to the other with little effort, but the situation borders on fetishistic. Fortunately, someone knocks on the front door at the most convenient moment, although why Baker would interrupt his pleasures for the door is another example of a character or entity being an idiot, which I wouldn't have minded if the entire plot of the story didn't hinge on characters being morons at pivotal points. So of course Madison escapes and successfully kills Baker before it cuts to black. Instead of being given the opportunity to explore the house some more and find concrete evidence that isn't just a name scribbled down on a card. What about bank statements or documents showing proof of the rental? Baker doesn't know he's tangled in the origami killer's connection web, so you'd expect that he'd have some official documentation that proves he did business with Paco. This is another case of David Cage not asking questions about his script. Apparently, two twisted killers' lives are related by pure coincidence. Bravo, David. Bravo. So Madison heads to the Blue Lagoon with some new clothes, which she presumably got from her apartment since she didn't bring her clothes to the motel, which I don't mind since it actually avoids the plot hole of why she didn't check up on Ethan in the 10 hours plus since killing a guy, although I have to wonder how she was able to interrogate Paco, go home and get dressed and get back to the motel within half an hour. Funny how she's already gotten over killing a guy and nearly getting penetrated by a cordless drill in the span of half a day. I would have locked myself away and stayed inside for several days and possibly develop a phobia of builders, although she inexplicably has a gun now. Fine? She goes to the club, which is playing arguably the worst club track I have ever heard in my entire life, and subjects herself to being sexualized to catch the attention of the sex-crazed Paco. You want to know how sex-crazed he is? The music he puts on in his office is just women having an orgasm to a backing track.
I'll take that. Just get in the way of the good thing, sweet cheeks.
Subtle. You want another example of David Cage being a creep? He actually designed a scenario where Madison can undress down to only her underpants and have the player catch a few moments of exposed breasts before the designers say, screw it, we'll just push them ahead and have her do a sexy dance that doesn't progress until the player grabs the lamp. And here's a reminder of what David Cage said about Madison's body when Sony got iffy about her getting unclothed at the drop of a hat. Now, I'm not against having exposed breasts or sexualization in the media, so long as it serves a purpose and is properly executed. Bayonetta is one of my favourite games of all time, and wears its sexualization on its sleeve, through characterization, camera angles, and some suggestive dialogue. It's consistent direction towards a consistent tone, but what I am getting from this gunpoint stripping sequence is that the purpose is to convey Paco as messed up and sex-obsessed. So why is the camera positioned and edited so that the player can get aroused at this, rather than show Paco's reaction? And if that wasn't enough, you can have Madison make moaning sounds to have a guard leave. If I wasn't so disgusted at the previous scene, I would have been okay with it, but it only serves to demonstrate that David Cage prioritizes Madison as an exploitative object first, crowbarred in love interest second, a get-out-of-jail-free card third, as we will soon see, and a well-defined character last. Oh yeah, and she squeezes his testicles to get some information. Paco rented the apartment, but didn't use it or even set foot in it. He gave the keys to a guy called John Shepherd, and with the information she wants, she leaves just as soon as Jayden walks into the club. Funny how Paco somehow managed to unstrap himself from the chair without any help in the span of a minute tops. Confident that Ethan isn't the origami killer, she goes back to the motel to get updated with what he is going through. Q leaning in for the kiss, and being rejected promptly. So here's a question I propose. What reason does she have to lean in for a kiss? Is it to comfort Ethan as he's not only killed someone, but whose son is getting closer to drowning? I'm pretty sure leaning in for a hug would do that sufficiently, not getting undressed and getting funky under the bed sheets. What do these two people know about each other that's attractive? Ethan knows Madison has insomnia and used to fix up her brothers after fights, and Madison knows that his son is currently drowning and Ethan is being subjected to torturous trials she knows very little about. I find his son drowning attractive. I need to make this guy mine. Stat. This is a situation that Madison herself knows is stupid, yet doesn't have a rational explanation for why she leaned into Ethan in the first place, but nevertheless is comfortable in warning Ethan that the police have arrived. Frankly, I'm surprised Carter Blake was unable to recognize her, since he got a pretty good look at her when she arrived at the burnt-out apartment, in addition to the receptionist not paying attention to Madison calling to warn Ethan. Even if you don't warn Ethan, the sequence where Ethan runs away from the police takes place, once again demonstrating how useless Madison is in the bigger picture. Madison arrives at the hospital and wait, what? The police didn't confiscate the motorbike despite it belonging to, according to Blake, an accomplice to the origami killer? She even uses it in her encounter with Baker, in which she disregards parking laws. I would say she makes enough to own a few motorbikes, since she has enough to afford the standard David Cage swanky apartment seen in Fahrenheit and Beyond Two Souls, but let's be honest, his underdeveloped writing is to blame given what I've already shown you in the previous sections. She somehow tracked down Anne Shepard to discover that she's the first person in 10 years to visit her. Somehow, her room is literally down the corridor from the reception, which is strange for an entrance that also serves to admit emergency cases. Her room should be up some floors, since the closest rooms would be for emergency admittance. Even my limited amount of time in hospitals has shown me that you have to go up some stairs and down some corridors just to get to the intensive care unit. Anyways, David Cage doesn't understand how Alzheimer's or dementia works, and as someone who has two members of their family suffer from the same illness, it insults me. The disease kills nerves in the brain, and it most certainly doesn't kill fundamental early memories you may have. They tend to go last after more recent memories. Anne Shepard has been in the hospital for 10 years, but she only remembers John. Considering John Shepard is a twin, Anne by all accounts should remember Scott, even if it's a little selective. Objects and people's faces can trigger memories, but it's not a key to unlock a major aspect of your life. We all know why this was written this way, of course. It's so that we don't reveal that Scott is the origami killer, just short of that fact being revealed. But if you're going to use something as sensitive topic as Alzheimer's, you need to thoroughly research it so you don't come across as incompetent or insensitive. It certainly doesn't help that Anne Shepard's voice acting is terrible.
What other son? I have no other son. I never had any children.
Christ, I hate this chapter. So after triggering Anne's memory by bringing in an orchid, an origami figure, and a picture of the twin she has lying around, she tells Madison to come closer so she can tell her the name of the twin. Scott Shelby is the origami killer. Madison is shocked, disturbed, dumbfounded, even though she has never met Scott Shelby or mentioned his name throughout the entire game. For all she knows, it could be just another lead that leads to another. Hell, she doesn't even state how she found Scott Shelby's home. For all we know, the PI facade Shelby has only exists on business cards and his front door. He might not even be listed in the phone book just to be sure he couldn't be found if things go awry. Madison, for no reason whatsoever, is convinced that Scott Shelby is the origami killer. Which he is, no argument there, but David Cage's awful writing fails to explain how she knows him or why she is so shocked that he could be the origami killer.
Not a thing. I can't find a thing. What if Anne gave me the wrong name?
So she successfully breaks into his home and confirms that he was able to kidnap children due to him wearing a police uniform. I'm pretty sure children would be extremely suspicious of a police officer not being in a police car. Or it could be Sean's generation is comprised of morons, considering the lack of common sense Jason had before he died. She finds a secret room which houses the orchids and the tools Scott uses as the origami killer. She inexplicably finds a laptop, successfully guesses his password, and the address Sean is held at is plastered front and center of the screen. Why? Why should the address the boy is held at be put on the screen like that? Does Scott have several properties in which he kills the children? If so, why isn't there a menu to select the cameras and view live? Which I believe he can do considering he watched Ethan cut off a piece of his finger in front of one and take the poison in another. I guess I have to add genius programmer to the things Scott apparently is if he got a complex AI to identify self-mutilation. Why did he have a window containing the exact address, letter to letter, open upon logging in? If he was suddenly searched and had the laptop found, his plan for the father to be the one to rescue the son would be rendered mute. This address isn't found with any effort. Madison literally types in the password and presto, you have the address to Sean.
Got it. Max. The name John gave to his paper dogs when he was a child. What the hell is that? An address. It's gotta be where Sean Mars is. Hurry, there's no time to lose.
Why does the origami killer have folders called Origami, Orchid, and Sean Mars? Yes, we get it. Scott is the origami killer. Considering this game is rated Peggy 18, I'm pretty sure those playing it would have gotten the message. What files would you store in Orchid anyway?
So you found my little secret?
Madison tries to leave, but is held at gunpoint by Scott, whose attitude is now of a merciless killer, instead of the apologetic killer who says sorry to the children he kills. He forces Madison back into the fridge, that somehow doesn't have an emergency exit button, like almost all industrial doors like this should have, and Madison is forced to find a way out. Yeah, Madison knows his secret, a secret he's so desperate to keep quiet that he doesn't just shoot her! If the police come, just hide the body in the fridge and feign ignorance. If you go by the plot so far, Scott is well respected in the police force, and they are completely inept at investigation procedure, so he'd have nothing to lose if he'd shot her. Oh, and the apartment is on fire. Madison escapes before the apartment explodes by jumping from window to window or hiding in a goddamn fridge, and is given the choice to either ring up Ethan Mars to give him the address, or ring up Norman Jayden to give him the address. Somehow, not only does she have Ethan's phone number, but she somehow has the phone number, name, and knowledge of Jayden's occupation, despite the two never meeting in the game outside of chase sequences when Ethan is presumed to be the killer. Jayden is from out of town, and the closest the two get to a casual encounter is when she walks past him at the Blue Lagoon. If she calls Jayden, she openly admits that he doesn't know her, implying that she somehow knows him. Now you could argue that she called Jayden at the police station, but here's the thing, she doesn't know Jayden's specific number and would have to go through reception to get him on the phone, and if you correctly solve the mystery in his final chapter, he immediately leaves to get Sean, so she called his cell phone number that was never given to her. But you know what pisses me off about the chapter? What really infuriates me about Madison's story? It's that she's a get-out-of-jail-free card. She has single-handedly rendered everything we did in Ethan and Jayden's storylines completely worthless. All that investigating, surviving Mad Jack and the Blue Lagoon, killing a guy who has kids, suffering through self-mutilation, endangering his life, and swallowing poison to solve a hangman puzzle. What was left of Ethan's and Jayden's stories that was pretty good to interesting, made completely redundant by one of the worst characters in gaming, going through one of the most poorly thought out and offensive storylines in gaming. And this game is considered one of the best video games of all time. It still is. Somehow. So, yeah. Madison can call either Ethan or Jayden before she herself sets off to the warehouse. Finally, I've gone through each individual story if everything went fine. The only two people who are guaranteed to survive at this point are Scott and Ethan, which is unfortunate since it shows that David Cage doesn't have the courage to give death real consequences. Jayden's situation with Corda I can forgive since the beating was prolonged enough just to make me a little nervous, but failing the electricity trial and the drug dealer trial just ends with Ethan leaving the premises. Same with Scott when he turns into Fat John Wick. Still, I have got through this trash to the point where I can look at the final chapter and the endings for what they are. The final chapter has 8 different scenarios, and they all depend firstly on whether Ethan, Jayden or Madison make it to the warehouse, and secondly on if Jayden or Madison are dead. One of them is just no one showing up and Sean drowning, which doesn't need an analysis because it's just Sean dying. Pretty self-explanatory, though I'll get to the corresponding epilogue soon. So to explain how baffling the endings are in terms of structure, I'm going to have to refer back to the butterfly effect based on everyone turning up to save Sean, otherwise known as the best ending. Ethan arrives and enters the warehouse. He runs towards Sean but is surprised to see Scott Shelby waiting for him. He reinforces why he put on the trials, then he reveals that he was there when Jason died. Okay, so if the origami killer was testing fathers to see if they really love their sons after being neglectful in some capacity, why Ethan? Scott saw with his own eyes that yes, Ethan is willing to sacrifice himself to save his children. Did Ethan accidentally inspire Scott to pursue killing children to test fathers? Was Scott's ultimate plan to kill several kids before pinning it on Ethan Mars? That would be some serious long-term planning because it doesn't make any sense why Ethan should go through this. It was Sean that was more absent and distant, not Ethan. In fact, Ethan has been trying to rebuild his life since Jason died. Unsuccessfully, but he has tried. If Ethan was more neglectful of Sean, then sure, I'd understand, but Scott's choice of victim doesn't make any sense when you factor in previous events and motivations. If Scott has been looking for a long time for a father who would risk his life to save his son, wouldn't he have already seen such during his time in the police force? Or is the entire city inhabited exclusively by greedy and neglectful fathers? Whatever, Scott says he has suffered just as much as his victims, although that is debatable considering Scott is still alive and his victims are dead, and tells Ethan that he just needs to open the grate to get to Sean. As Ethan starts working on it, Scott pulls out a gun and prepares to shoot him, when suddenly a wild Jayden appears. Not sure how he got into the building other than the front door, but I can buy the ambush. So why did Scott want to shoot Ethan? He passed every trial and found his son, and even if you only pass 3 or 4 of them, he'll still prepare to shoot. It would mean that Ethan would be vindicated posthumously, and Scott wouldn't come across as someone who is trying to test fathers. In fact, it makes Scott look even worse in a game that has tried to humanize him throughout the course of the playthrough. It's such a jarring attitude change and reeks of lazy characterization. Sure, Scott might have put on a facade in front of the victims' families, but considering the slither of second thought seen with Madison and his justification to Ethan, suddenly pulling a gun out is inconsistent characterization. So Scott runs away and Jayden goes after— wait, hold up. Rewind. So Jayden and Scott falls to our left and lands on the floor, but as the two are starting to get up, the camera cuts to see Scott rotated 180 degrees and running to his left without any connecting animation. As Jayden gets up to raise his gun to the point we hear an equipping sound effect, the camera cuts to show Jayden sprinting after Scott. Ethan starts turning his attention back to Sean, but the next cut continues Ethan's animation while Jayden and Scott appear in 2 different locations. When you watch the sequence at full speed, it's really hard to tell what is going on. The shot of Scott starting to run implicates he's going to go further left of the warehouse, judging by his position in the previous shot. If he didn't rotate 180 degrees, then it would have been the case, but because we just have a second to take in the repositioning, combined with Jayden getting up, this makes this crane shot all the more confusing. It's 5 seconds of bad camera positioning, bad editing, and bad blocking, and as much as David Cage loves to use other visual media as his reference, his understanding of basic visual storytelling, editing, and cinematography is baffling. You want to know what would fix this? Make the sequence a little longer, have Scott start running towards these steps and the ladders he climbs, have Jayden fire one bullet before it jams, before telling Ethan to save Sean as he runs after him. This would pay off Ethan's prison escape in a small but satisfying way, while also making the sequence both easier to follow and more dramatic. Ethan manages to unlock the grate by breaking a pretty thick lock with a metal support bar, and drags out Sean from the well. In a case of continuity error, Sean appears to have his head above the water in one shot, before appearing underwater in the next. We cut to Jayden now on the roof of the warehouse, before he is suddenly ambushed by Scott. Where the hell was he? So the two fight on a conveyor belt that's above the police, who arrived for some reason. It's pretty baffling that the police don't know these two are fighting, despite having a sniper and a helicopter on hand, and before you say it's because of the noise the rain makes, Scott throws a television at Jayden right above them. The crash it would make would draw attention to the two, but as we've established before, the police have as much collective intelligence as an infant in this game. The action is interrupted by Madison arriving, and Blake preparing the forces to fire upon Ethan. As Madison runs towards the warehouse entrance, Blake calls out to her, and she stops. Instead of running towards the warehouse, since the police are very unlikely to fire upon someone who isn't the killer, she walks right up to Blake to tell him that she's a journalist, and that Ethan isn't the origami killer. This goes as well as you expect, and Blake tells her to get out of the way, instead of arresting her for assisting Ethan's escape since he got a decent look at her back at the lizard trial. Cuts back to the action, and come to think of it, it's a bit dangerous for loose scrap to be put on a conveyor belt that lacks barriers on both sides, especially when it's travelling over areas frequented by civilians and workers. The action continues and it gets a bit rough, alongside the editing as we suddenly cut to emotional music and Ethan performing CPR on his unconscious son. For a moment, it looks like he's failed, and it's actually executed pretty well. Sean coughs back to life, and unfortunately that means hearing his awful acting again.
Dad, I knew you'd come and save me.
God, he's annoying. So if you took the poison in the last trial, he checks his clock and sees that time is running out. He says his last goodbyes, and soon enough, the clock counts to 0. Almost immediately, Ethan is glad that he isn't dead, and since it's impossible to measure the exact time it takes for poison to kill someone, since it depends on a lot of factors, him celebrating being alive could be premature. Imagine if a few seconds into celebrating, the poison starts kicking in. Entirely possible if it really was poison. Still, regardless, the immediate conclusion feels rushed. It feels like an editor decided to cut out a few seconds of silence as Ethan takes in the revelation due to time constraints. But since this is a video game and not film or television, the lack of its inclusion says more about Cage's directing abilities. Also, if Scott wanted to kill Ethan, why not use real poison instead of fake poison? Cut back to Madison as she is about to be dragged away by the police, but she elbows the officer away before running back to her bike. Instead of driving through the wide gap, she instead joyrides around for no real reason, but to give the player an opportunity to fail. If you succeed, she crashes it into a car and walks the rest of the way anyway. Why didn't Blake recognize her again since she arrived at the trial on a bike? So she gets inside and tells Ethan that the police will likely shoot him if he goes out alone, before giving him the bright idea to carry Sean out of the warehouse with herself beside him. She tells him that she has all the evidence he needs to be acquitted. Though what that evidence is unknown since some of it is just burnt down rubble, Baker and Paco are dead, and the only alive witness is a woman with Alzheimer's. Not a condition rated highly for reliable witness testimony. Ethan apologizes to Madison, who says it doesn't matter because Sean is safe, before it cuts back to Jayden. Some more fighting and some more bad editing where Scott suddenly stands up, and if you hit a specific quick-time event right, he falls over but grips on for dear life. He asks Jayden to save him, and if you do, the fight continues. Eventually, you grab a metal beam, and if successful, Scott falls to his death in the crusher below. Although I'm not too sure you can call it a crusher considering the wide gap between the two moving components. Jayden is safe, Scott is dead, and Ethan and Madison exit the warehouse together with Sean. While the action sequence in general is okay in terms of choreography, the way it awkwardly cuts back to two completely different situations with different tones is jarring. Scott takes a weapon away from Jayden, and as he's approaching him, it suddenly cuts to Madison. When it returns, it continues that approach as if nothing happened. Funnily enough, they almost got one of the cuts right, but once again it feels half-assed. Both Jayden and Scott fall down, so they're stationary, but it cuts so fast that it comes across as poorly paced. An extra second or an aerial shot of the two just lying down on the conveyor belt would have given the chapter a better sense of flow. So the game is completed. Ethan and Sean start a new life in another oversized apartment, which is kind of a weird trope of David Cage products that's more understandable in films and television than video games. Madison capitalizes on her experience with Ethan to publish a book. Jayden kicks his drug habit but is experiencing permanent damage from the Arry, and Lauren spits on Scott's grave while giving off a really bad performance. If Lauren is dead, then it's just a shot of his grave, and if you suffer through that awful romance and accompanying sex scene, Madison moves into the oversized apartment with Ethan and Sean. What happened to Grace? Aren't she and Ethan technically still married? Whatever, that's the end of the game. So before I look into the other variations of the chapter, I want to put key moments on a timeline. Ethan arrives first, Scott then arrives, Ethan starts opening the grate while Scott prepares to fire, Jayden arrives, Ethan saves Sean while the police likely prepare their position outside, and Madison later arrives. This timeline is going to be very important because I want you to understand why David Cage doesn't understand how the butterfly effect works, and to demonstrate, let's take Jayden out of the picture. This variation starts as you'd expect. Ethan arrives, runs to Sean, then immediately starts saving him. He successfully does so without Scott turning up and preparing to shoot him. Already we are seeing inconsistencies in the construction of the plot. It's likely David Cage wrote and directed the bigger moments like the action sequences and saving Sean before stitching together some dialogue with no thought into if it makes sense. Madison arrives at about the right time, just after saving Sean, since the structure of the previous variation could have all three sequences chronologically take place at the same time. Of course, Madison arriving raises a huge question, which I will get into shortly. Scott suddenly appears and congratulates him for saving Sean, once again contradicting the established timeline, and then tells him that because Madison knows who the killer is, he has to kill both of them. He successfully shoots Ethan before going after Madison. Instead of shooting her, he tries to grapple her, but she escapes and, hey! They do use that staircase! Why didn't Jayden and Scott use it previously? Anyways, Madison gets on the roof first, but before she can get any further, a wild Scott appears, who managed to find another way to the roof and ambush the woman much faster than it took for her to reach the roof. For Christ's sake, he's overweight and has asthma! So Madison runs away when Scott finally realizes he has a gun, but somehow forgot the skills he used in Kramer's house against professionals, and now shoots like a stormtrooper when put up against an injured journalist. He manages to hit her, but from the lack of any blood on her leg, it's really hard to judge if the leg injury she got was from tripping up or if a bullet actually hit her. So Scott fires a load of bullets and misses at close range before realizing he is out of ammo. He throws the gun aside on the floor instead of in the water where the police won't be able to easily find it, and chases Madison up a crane. Holy shit, he just broke through solid glass using his bare fists! Not even Goldberg was able to do that without sustaining an injury, and even then it took him 5 tries to get through. So he pulls a metal bar out of his ass and manages to throw Madison back outside and onto the crane's arm. It looks like he's about to go for the kill, when suddenly... Okay, 2 things. 1, where the hell was Ethan hiding that gun? Did he have it in the car so when he recovered from that gunshot to the stomach, he went back outside to pick up the gun, then followed them around the dock, climbed the ladder, took aim, then fired? Okay, maybe he's running on adrenaline, but how was he able to see the two others after he went through a container yard with limited visibility caused by the rain? 2, you're going to use that sound effects for your gun? It sounds so compressed and doesn't feel like it belongs in this scene. I get that you're going to have to outsource some things. Hell, Amnesia: The Dark Descent's sound and atmosphere, that was arguably key to its ability to scare people, was outsourced. But could you get a more impactful sound than that? So Scott dies and Ethan and Madison crawl on the crane, and then the game ends in the same way. Except Jayden tenders his resignation and ditches his glasses, or we see Blake screw around with the array if Jayden is dead. Except... yeah, it's pretty stupid. So we can see that already some of the fundamentally established events in the original timeline are contradicted. Scott doesn't surprise Ethan before he starts saving his son, instead opting to do so after Sean is saved. Sorry, but by all logic, Scott should ambush Ethan before he starts saving Sean. You want to know how David Cage misunderstands the butterfly effect? At the end of the action sequence, Scott tries to swing and impale Madison with a metal bar before getting shot by Ethan. If Madison dies here, however, Ethan doesn't turn up in any way. He's not there at all. He's back at the warehouse. So Madison's ability to dodge Scott's attacks has the ability to retroactively determine if Ethan went after them or not, and the effects are seen a few seconds later. David Cage, the butterfly effect doesn't work that way! Now you might have noticed something missing, something very significant absent from the entire sequence. That would be the police officers and Carter Blake. They are nowhere to be seen. In fact, they don't appear at all in any way in this chapter, so not only is the event sequence out of order for no logical reason, but a very significant part that determines if Ethan is in danger of being shot is no longer there. But Hudson, some of you might say. Jayden might have brought the police officers with him unintentionally. Did you see Carter Blake's face when he left the station? It's entirely possible that Scott Shelby always intended to reveal himself after Ethan saved Sean. Is it possible that he heard the officers set up their ambush outside, so had to reveal himself earlier than intended? Okay, first of all, that doesn't really explain why Scott would want to suddenly kill Ethan, since he does have a way out of the warehouse that the police won't consider. And second... in the timeline where it's just Ethan and Jayden, it plays out exactly the same without Madison being there, and the police officers aren't there. It's just Ethan rescuing Sean, Scott pulling his gun on Ethan, Jayden suddenly appearing, same action sequence. Except it flows a little better, but it still isn't edited well. So Scott couldn't have hidden himself, then forced to reveal himself early, because the police don't turn up. And why should they? Jayden was pulled from the case when it was determined that Ethan Mars was the origami killer. So why should the police pay attention to someone who says the origami killer isn't really the origami killer? At first I thought the police found Ethan because the stolen taxicab was reported, but nope. So how did the police find Ethan in the warehouse when Jayden doesn't trust them, Madison doesn't call them, and clearly Ethan didn't call them? Their appearance is so inconsistent with little explanation other than... well, actually, I can't think of a reason. When a game relies heavily on choice, the consequences need to make sense. Oh, but you know which ending the police do turn up at? The one where Ethan goes in alone, and once again the timeline is out of whack. Ethan goes in and rescues Sean, then Scott enters. Not only does he not attempt to kill Ethan, but he gives Ethan the opportunity to kill him, which he can do with the handgun. So why did he attempt to kill Ethan in the previous chapter variations? Is it because someone else knows his secret? You know, Jayden doesn't have to be dead for this ending to happen. Same with Madison. Regardless if Scott knows they are alive or not, it shouldn't affect whether or not he reveals himself and prepares to kill him. The only time he prepares to kill Ethan without Sean being rescued is if Jayden is somehow involved, and since Scott has no way to determine if Jayden is alive or not, it shouldn't affect his decision to try and kill Ethan. Does Scott have an informant at the police department that gives him updates? Right, big problem. Jayden walks out of the police station to head towards the docks without telling anybody. So how can they determine if Jayden is on their way to rescue Sean? Oh, you know the gun Ethan uses on Scott? How is he able to repair it, considering he had to take the handle off the gun in his 4th trial? Well, to be fair, it's only a concern if you actually shot the dealer, but Ethan has never used a gun in his life. Did he repair it while he was moping on the floor back at the motel? Whatever, Ethan starts to leave the warehouse. The police are there, and due to a misunderstanding, Blake orders Ethan to be shot. Ethan is dead, Sean weeps awfully, as the game ends. Madison's gravestone is shown on the news, or if she failed to find the address on Scott's laptop, her insomnia worsens and she's unable to tell reality from her dreams. Although why she wouldn't be relieved that Sean survived is beyond me. Fun fact, if Madison failed the stupid motorbike sequence, Ethan still dies, yet she goes on to sell her story in a successful book. So her ability to find an address determines how bad her insomnia gets? Regardless, Jayden resigns, Blake and Perry get suspended through the medium of news broadcast, and Ethan's gravestone is shown with Sean weeping. Scott leaves, scot-free. Unless you save Lauren from drowning, in which she confronts you. She called the origami killer's victims' families, somehow, and they told her that they didn't hire Scott to investigate. Somehow, she gets it in her head that this must mean that Scott used the facade to collect evidence and wipe out anything that might connect him to the killings. Well, she guesses right, but even if Scott wasn't exposed on television as the killer, she still draws that conclusion. So instead of, well, I don't know, feigning ignorance and claim that the person who hired him said that they was a family member of a victim, he stands there with a stern face, essentially admitting that he did that. This happens even if Madison was killed before she arrived in the apartment, so the gas explosion wouldn't have happened. Or did he burn down the apartment anyway in an extreme effort to hide his past? He could claim a gas explosion or arson destroyed his apartment to Lauren, not just straight up admit his crimes without saying a word. Pin the explosion on Kramer! He tried to kill the two of them already! Oh, and she pulls a gun out of nowhere and basically kills him in the middle of the street. You get this ending if Scott kills his opponent of choice, by the way. Jesus Christ, I didn't think analysing the different variations of the chapter would take this long, but when the timeline is entirely dependent on which playable characters arrive at the scene instead of logical factors, the flaws in character and event consistency show themselves from space. Fortunately, all the endings featuring Ethan are covered, so we only have 3 more to examine, and since Shelby's action sequences and most of the epilogues are covered, it's going to be a lot easier and a lot quicker to cover them. Let's see what happens if only Madison and Jayden arrive on the scene. It gets unbelievable when compared to the above endings pretty fast. Because Madison arrives first! Sorry, no, that shouldn't be the case! The previous sequence that featured Jayden and Madison together had Jayden arrive way before her, and logically that should be the case here! Okay, I would be forgiving if Jayden solving the puzzle correctly could determine what time he arrives, like he sets off later because Madison's call helped him since he couldn't pinpoint the killings, but no! Madison always arrives first with no variation! Madison arrives, and as she's about to start rescuing Sean, Jayden arrives to ask if Sean is okay. Scott, understandably not happy that Ethan isn't there, starts attacking the two. You know which action sequence you get in this ending? You get Madison's! Even though Jayden is an experienced member of the FBI, a quick kick knocks him out long enough for Madison and Scott to get to the roof. Scott had every opportunity to shoot Jayden, but again opts not to do so. Also, Scott runs out of ammo at the exact same location, and this is not determined by how many bullets he fired, even though he logically should have one more bullet since there was no Ethan to shoot. At least make the effort to at least animate the gun jamming if you don't run out of bullets in the allotted time. The scene where Scott chases Madison and Jayden saves Sean is once again atrociously cut together, although I do think the cut when Madison tries to lock herself in the crane's controls was a decent cut. Jayden saves Sean. Wait, he used his gun to break the lock? Isn't that extremely dangerous, especially at close range? Why didn't Ethan do the same thing, since he has a gun on his person? Anyways, Jayden saves Sean, and if Madison survives long enough, he shoots Scott. Some of the same questions arise, like how Jayden was able to find Scott and Madison in torrential rain and through a container maze still exist, except you replace Ethan with Jayden, but now I'm just repeating myself. Ethan's name gets cleared and he is let out of his cell, or you start a new life in that oversized apartment. So, regardless of what happens, does the divorce still happen? Grace is there to see Ethan get let go and bring Sean to see him, but is she still upset about what happened to Jason? Are they on friendly or speaking terms? Some closure on this would be nice. If Jayden goes in on his own, the timeline once again goes all over the place, with Jayden saving Sean in the same way as before, and Scott arriving after he is rescued. Ideally, if we were being consistent with arrival times, it should be Scott waiting out of sight and immediately ambushing Jayden. Cue action sequence before Jayden returns to save Sean. It would mean that Scott is doing his damnedest to ensure only Ethan can save Sean. That is his ultimate goal, after all, to find a father that would endanger himself to save their son. It should be noted that while Jayden is chasing Scott, he calls Carter Blake and tells him to get his ass over to the warehouse. So why not have it so Jayden saves Sean after the action sequence? Well, they save it for Madison, even though it endangers Sean even more since he's drowning pretty much from the second Scott enters the picture. Not that the animators bothered conveying that. Madison arrives and Scott soon follows, confirming that, yes, he thought she died in the explosion. So with no backup from the two men with guns, she has to fend off Scott herself, and successfully does so by impaling him with that metal bar. Bit cartoonish, but alright. Scott is dead, but she remembers what she came here to do, and saves Sean the same way Ethan does. Except we get a view of the well itself, and bloody hell, how deep was that well? Sean was already floating when he was kidnapped. The boy's got some serious endurance. Sean is safe, cue appropriate ending, and cue the credits. You know the worst thing about replaying the ending over and over again? You can't skip the credit sequence. When you look at the bigger picture, the only chapters that determine the ending you get are really isolated to 3 chapters. Sure, you can complete the trials, solve the mystery, and escape Scott's apartment with or without the address, but I was able to replay the endings by simply using the events of those 3 chapters. Don't want Ethan at the scene? Just pick the wrong address and have Madison either dead or not ring him up. Don't want Jayden to arrive? Just have him accuse Blake and not be given the address, or simply give up the final puzzle, or kill him by using the Arry too much, since it's the only chapter he gets killed by it. Don't want Madison? Ignore the address or just have her jump out of the window to her death. Pretty amusing that the choice is there in a dumb way. But I know what you're all thinking. How can you drown Sean, and what happens? Sean can drown if Madison dies and no one else arrived, or if no one shows up to save him. You get the insomnia ending for Madison, a variation of Scott walking down the street, and if Jayden is alive, you see him hallucinate without the Arry glasses. He's become an emotional wreck as he talks to himself. Literally. Then he overdoses on tryptocane and dies. Pretty depressing, but it is an appropriate end considering his entire backstory. As for Ethan, you get to choose where you commit suicide. If Ethan chose the wrong address, then he blows his brains out in a motel room somewhere. It could be his home, but that's not what bothers me. Why does he have origami figures scattered around the room? If Madison or Jayden didn't tell him or indicate that he wasn't the killer, then I'd understand. But in this playthrough, he's told he's innocent. It would have been a nice detail to add if he thought he was the killer right up to the last moment of his life. If Ethan was arrested, then he is framed for the killings, and hangs himself in his cell surrounded by origami. Again, I wish the origami's existence was determined by if Ethan was told he's not the killer. Of course, the worst variation of Ethan's suicide involves Madison, because of course it fucking does! The two are attending Sean's grave when Madison proposes that they leave the city, Ethan gets a job as an architect, and Madison work in journalism. She says they'll finally forget what happened, although I think forgetting that 12 years of your life ended in a horrible way would be impossible, something Ethan even admits. As he's upset at the new reality, Madison straight up says, "I want you to give me a child." She actually says that while Sean's body isn't even cold, right next to his tombstone. I'm not sure if I should be disgusted with Madison's blatant disregard of Ethan's feelings, or amazed that this was something David Cage wrote on a script, and went with it. She says that they'll have a boy with Ethan's eyes and they'll watch him grow up through the years. Oh my god, Jesus Christ. This is some of the most stupid shit I have ever heard in pretty much the worst place to do so in. And further cements that Madison is the worst character in the entire game. Ethan sends Madison away, and as she's not looking, he pulls out a gun. Madison tries to stop him, but too late. Ethan blows his brains out in the cemetery. After that conversation, I would call it a mercy killing. The end! Boy, what a mess. For a game continuously praised for its narrative, with Game Informer saying that it raises the bar for video game storytelling, actually looking at the story as a whole presents glaring problems, both big and small. Ethan's blackouts are introduced and never seen again. Scott's bank account somehow allowing him to acquire plenty of equipment and property access. The police being incredibly incompetent. Every actor and child being given some of the most terrible direction I've seen in a video game. Everything about Madison's existence, and the inconsistency between the endings. The best comparison I can give the story is the Rookie story in Halo 3 ODST. When you really look at it, it's just a guy picking up some stuff and moving on. But while that game appropriately chopped up its narrative to give a more fulfilling experience, Heavy Rain chops up its chapters because that's what highbrow movies and stories do, in addition to hiding some of the glaring plot holes. Remember, Madison found Ethan at the Lizard trial without following him. If she did follow him and just waited for him to come out, that would have been fine, but by having her arrive at the tail end of the trial, it creates a huge plot hole. People call the storytelling in Heavy Rain art, but to be honest, I don't know why. Is it because the story decided to keep itself in a fairly realistic environment? Is it because it's a murder mystery and not some fantasy killing spree game? I get that both of those are refreshing, but that doesn't make it good. Its storytelling doesn't belong in the same ballpark as BioShock, Spec Ops: The Line, Final Fantasy VI, Red Dead Redemption, or The Walking Dead. That last one especially, because it arguably uses some of the same mechanics Heavy Rain does, and delivered what is considered one of the most heartbreaking, emotional, and well-written games ever. Okay, maybe some of those other games have plot holes and questionable details, but they're not enough to completely break your narrative. Not to say Heavy Rain doesn't have things I like. I liked it more than the Order 1886, even though it's more because I didn't rate Heavy Rain as a 1 out of 10. While I do hate this narrative, not only because of its construction, but because of it being placed on a high pedestal, I would rate this game maybe a 2 or 3 out of 10 upon reflection. Even 7 years later, the lizard trial still makes me wince uncomfortably, and that's something I don't think any other game has done to me outside of Dead Space 2, so points for that. In addition, the game is scattered with little things I really like. I liked the fact that the filter you get with Jayden depends on whether or not you have the glasses on, and that's reflected in the action sequences. I thought Scott being the origami killer was a neat twist that was unfortunately filled with an unnecessary subplot that ends ridiculously. The music, while repetitive in its usage, is excellent and recognisable, which makes it all the more sad that composer Normand Corbell is no longer with us. Most importantly though, this game actually has a sense of identity. The visual representation of the mechanics may be unclear and shows why 6-axis control schemes aren't desirable, but take any screenshot of Heavy Rain and show it to a casual gamer and they'll say, ah, it's Heavy Rain. The visual representation is, in itself, iconic, and their placement on the screen was actually well thought out when it came to the action sequences. And speaking of technical details, even though I am playing the HD remaster, which showcases the Uncanny Valley on an uncomfortable scale, this game did set the benchmark for visuals before the HD version. It's up there with the original Doom and Crysis in terms of technical achievement, and comparing this game to Fahrenheit showcases how a new generation can push visual fidelity. I may prefer art design than realism, but I have to applaud the technical accomplishment of Quantic Dream. Unfortunately, it doesn't make up for all the decisions that come back to the writing and direction. In this case, David Cage. The choices in this game only truly matter in 3 chapters. The game is not willing to go all the way with death being a possibility, as showcased with Ethan being invincible in trials that should by all rights kill him, and the women in this game being either sex objects, ham-fisted romance participants, or heavily underdeveloped. While I don't agree with Cage that Game Over is a failure of the game designer, in this case a lack of Game Over was a failure with Heavy Rain's design. It would have been interesting if Scott or Ethan could be killed in earlier situations. It would have shown commitment to delivering a more grounded narrative. Also, relatively minor nitpick, but some of the split screen effects make it harder to grasp what is really going on. It took a couple of viewings to really understand what went on when Jason got hit by the car. As it stands, it's certainly interesting if not well thought out. It's a game plagued with decisions given half-assed treatment that's bafflingly got an 87 on Metacritic. But at least it isn't Beyond Two Souls, and oh boy, Beyond Two Souls.